Well, hey guys, I hope your week is going well. In today's video, I'm going to address your questions and requests to cover early graying of the hair, or going gray early on. This is also known as premature graying of the hair. Premature graying of the hair actually is defined as going gray before the age of 20 in Caucasians or before the age of 30 in African Americans. African Americans go gray later on in life, and the reason for that is differences in some of the biology of melanin. As far as premature graying of the hair in other ethnicities, we don't have a definition for that in other ethnic groups. But in Caucasians, it's before the age of 20, and in African Americans, before the age of 30. Overall, it is estimated, however, that somewhere around 20% of all people will have 50% of their hair be gray by the age of 50. That is kind of to be expected as far as the biology and expected time course of your hair going gray. Hair going gray is related to a few things in terms of the biology of how hair color is made, but why people go gray early in life as opposed to later in life is not clearly understood. It's largely thought to be due, as with everything, to be due to your genetics, but also some environmental influences as well, which I'll get into in today's video. Graying of the hair occurs as a result of loss of pigment production in the hair. And in order to kind of understand hair going gray, I'll tell you a few components of pigment biology that you might find helpful in understanding this. Just as in the skin, the hair follicle has some cells called melanocytes that make pigment. The pigment is called melanin. Those melanocytes, just as they do in the skin, pass that pigment on to the neighboring cells around them, and that leads to hair color. So in the case of hair, the melanocytes pass the pigment on to surrounding hair keratinocytes, and that causes hair color. Whereas in the skin, they pass them around to surrounding skin keratinocytes, and that is what is responsible for skin color or skin pigmentation. However, unlike in the skin, there's a little subtle difference in that in our skin, pigment is made on a continual basis, whereas pigment production in our hair coincides with specific phases of the hair cycle. If you're not familiar, our hair on our head as humans grows in cycles and waves and phases. The majority of the hairs on your head at any given time are in a growing phase called anagen. They then shift to what's called a resting phase or catagen, and then they shed. They become a telogen hair. That is the shedding phase. So for the most part, the majority of the hairs on your head are in that growing phase, the anagen phase, whereas roughly 10% of your hairs are in the telogen phase, and that is why you shed hair all the time, and it's normal to shed a couple of hundred hairs a day actually. But pigment production coincides with the hair cycle, and it only occurs during the growing phase of the hair cycle. And then it stops with the resting phase and ceases to nothing during the shedding phase. So shedding hairs are not making pigment anymore. That biology has been cut off. So within the hair follicle, there are hair melanocytes that make pigment, but with age and with graying of the hair, we lose some of those melanocytes because they become fragile, they become damaged, they die off, and we lose some of the hair melanocytes. If you look at a gray hair under the microscope, you will see fewer number of pigment-producing cells or melanocytes as opposed to the pigmented hair. The pigment also is not transported and transferred to the surrounding hair cells as efficiently in gray hairs, and that is what leads to graying of the hair as well. But like I said, why it happens in earlier life in some people and not others is not understood. But probably the process that is most well studied that explains graying of the hair is the generation of something called reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species, or oxidation, is a phenomenon that is occurring all of the time, and our body has systems in place to cope with it. What it is the generation of damaging oxygen radicals that damage DNA, damage proteins in the body, damage all sorts of molecules and things that are trying to do their thing. Reactive oxygen species generation is responsible for not only aging our hair through premature graying, but also our skin and pretty much all body systems. Reactive oxygen species are responsible. They are byproducts of inflammatory processes. They are also byproducts of everyday life processes, physiologic processes that occur in the body. That's why we have some mechanisms in place to cope with those. But we do have a lot of evidence to show that it's the generation of reactive oxygen species in the hair melanocyte, the cell that makes hair color. Generation of reactive oxygen species, rendering that cell fragile, leads to graying of the hair. Not only the generation of reactive oxygen species, but becoming unable, for whatever reason, to cope with those reactive oxygen species. It seems that melanocytes in the hair, with time, lose some expression of some of the enzymes that handle these reactive oxygen species. Things like catalase, for example. And in terms of pigment production, it's really a key part of melanocyte biology to have a good system in place for coping with reactive oxygen species, because part of how pigment is made involves an oxidation step and the generation of free radicals. So the cell needs to have a good antioxidant system in place to cope with that. And through time, through age-related things, perhaps genetics, it seems as though that system becomes overwhelmed and not very efficient. And then the melanocyte, the cell responsible for making pigment, suffers and dies off. And that is something that leads to graying of the hair. Now, I alluded to the fact that generation of free radicals in the hair is part of how pigment is made, and it's just, part of life. However, there are free radicals that are generated as a result of our environment. UV exposure is probably one of the key causes of free radical generation in not only our skin, but also our hair, and probably responsible for killing off some of those pigment cells that make hair color and lead to graying of the hair. Not only UV, but also pollution and environmental stressors, and also psychological stress. We have several studies in people that correlate bouts of psychological stress, emotional stress, with premature graying of the hair. So no, that's not an old wives' tale. When somebody says, "Oh, you're stressing me out, and I can see a few more grays coming," that little joke, it's actually been substantiated that stress, emotional stress, does contribute to graying of the hair. Also, if you have a underlying disease process that is inflammatory, like an autoimmune disease or any number of diseases that are inflammatory, that can contribute to premature graying of the hair just through that added burden of pro-oxidant state through all of that inflammation. So certain medical conditions that are inflammatory, there is an association with premature graying of the hair. There was a study of young adults in Turkey that showed that premature graying of the hair was very closely related to factors of emotional stress, alcohol consumption, and chronic diseases. So alcohol, the beverage that many adults enjoy responsibly, it contributes to inflammation in the body, and the processes involved in coping with alcohol metabolism are very inflammatory, and that can be associated with premature graying of the hair. But no, if you enjoy alcohol in moderation, it doesn't mean your hair is all going to go gray overnight, but that has been associated. There is a disease of the skin and hair that many of you have asked me about in the comments, I believe you suffer from, called vitiligo. Vitiligo is an autoimmune disease in which your immune system attacks these pigment-producing melanocyte cells. And the presentation of that disease is white patches on the skin and loss of color in the hair, white streaks in the hair, can also affect the eyebrows and eyelashes. And so while vitiligo does not cause graying of the hair, and while the loss of color in the hair affected by vitiligo can be reversed with treatments, the cell types, the melanocytes, because they are kind of, maybe being pestered a little bit too much by the immune system, we think, are more fragile, more susceptible to damage from oxidative stress. And therefore, there is an association with the disease vitiligo, an autoimmune attack on the pigment-producing cells melanocyte. There is an association with vitiligo and premature graying of the hair. So that is another association. Also, vitamin deficiencies. I think most notably vitamin B12 deficiency has been associated with premature graying of the hair. There's a disease called pernicious anemia in which individuals cannot absorb vitamin B12 properly. And in that situation where there is vitamin B12 deficiency, there has been an association with premature graying of the hair, probably underscoring the key roles of B vitamins in our cell biology and function. And when that's deficient, our cells can't function optimally, and making pigment and hair color is the last thing on their mind. Not only vitamin B12 deficiency, but other vitamin and mineral deficiencies. But having gray hair does not mean you are vitamin deficient, as a side note. But in situations where there is vitamin deficiency, you might be more likely to experience premature graying of the hair. Thyroid disease also is associated with premature graying of the hair. Thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, actually tell our melanocytes to make pigment. And so when those hormones are low, as in the disease hypothyroidism, there is an association with premature graying of the hair. And then medications can also affect hair color and the susceptibility of those pigment-producing cells to oxidative damage. Certain chemotherapy medications for cancer can cause and be associated with premature graying of the hair. Many chemotherapy medications affect the processes and the signaling that incidentally happens in our pigment-producing cells, the melanocytes. So it's not unusual in certain as a side effect of certain chemotherapies to have a change in color of your hair. It's related to those medications interfering with the normal cell biology in the pigment-producing cells, the melanocytes. But medications and metabolic diseases aside that I've mentioned, nutritional deficiencies aside, the other strong association with premature graying of the hair is smoking. Smoking is probably one of the worst things that you can do. Anything that I could offer you on this channel that would help you with that, comment below. I really want to push that for you. If you are trying to quit smoking, that you give it a strong consideration. But in case you need another reason to quit, your hair is very likely to go gray much earlier, at least, than it would if you do not smoke. Smoking creates a lot of free radicals in the body, a lot of oxidative damage. It's too much for the pigment producing cells in your hair to cope with, and is therefore associated with early graying of the hair. So those are the associations, those are the clues as to what causes premature graying of the hair, just associated lifestyle factors. But like I said, we really don't have a clear cut, this is why people get premature graying of the hair and this is why other people don't. But be aware, that being said, be aware of nutraceuticals and the cosmetic industry trying to sell you on a cure or a preventative measure against premature graying of the hair. The very popular idea to consider taking nutritional supplements, vitamin supplements, minerals, selenium, and that sort of thing. And none of that today do we have any substantial scientific evidence to support that it works and that it's effective at preventing and or reversing graying of the hair. But the nutraceutical and supplement industry is very lucrative, so there are claims out there that certain antioxidant supplements and certain vitamins, minerals, what have you, fatty acids, you name it, are going to reverse graying of the hair, but we don't have any actual scientific proof that that is correct. Also, honestly, shampoos, conditioners claiming to prevent graying are such a gimmick. The melanocytes, the cells that make the hair color, they live deep down within your scalp in the hair follicle. Getting the antioxidants or getting whatever active ingredient they are selling you in these products down to that level where they would need to work is pretty unlikely. I'm very, very skeptical, as should you be, of any claims that a shampoo, conditioner, serum, oil, whatever name, mousse, hat, are going to prevent or reverse graying of the hair. Things that you can do, don't stress. Easier said than done, but having coping mechanisms in place to deal with stress, great for your whole body. And you know, your hair color is one thing that you could be working to protect in adapting some healthy lifestyle behaviors to cope with stress and to manage stress. Relaxation, taking a walk, that sort of thing. Getting good sleep. And then don't smoke. You know, smoking ages everything, including your hair, so don't smoke. And, you know, from a medical perspective, if a patient presents with this early graying of the hair, you know, it's not unusual or not unreasonable to consider checking the thyroid, because hypothyroidism is pretty common and is a treatable medical condition with thyroid replacement. Also, you know, B12 may be indicated, folate, certain lab studies may, you know, depending on your history that you give your doctor. But I hope this video was helpful to you guys in kind of clarifying what we do know and what we don't know, and helping you navigate any claims out there in terms of preventing or reversing premature graying of the hair. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and as always, don't forget, sunscreen and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.